Allow me to preface this video with a joke. It takes place during the first instance in history of Europeans and Asians eating together. They're sharing a meal, but they're seated on opposite sides of the dining table. This is what they have to say. "Look at these savages. They don't even know how to make forks. They pick at their food with wooden sticks," joked one European to another. "Look at these savages. They don't even know how to use chopsticks. They pick at their food with tiny rakes," joked one Asian to another. The room fills with laughter, oblivious to what the other side is joking about. However, there comes the laughter both sides are oblivious to, emanating from a source beyond their realm. "Look at these savages. They don't know they're all savages," joked one viewer as they pick at their food with their fingers. Communication is key to one's fate in FX's adaptation of James Clavell's epic, Shōgun. Set in the precarious time in Sengoku-era Japan after the deaths of his taiko. Tranquility balances off of the weight of 5 feuding regions, vowed to keep peace within the realm. However, all it takes is one sentence, word, or gesture to tip the scales off into all-out war. Japanese diplomacy and etiquette may prevent brazen attacks, but it only makes the threats far more furtive and deadly, masking deceit behind kind gestures, hostages as guests, and secrets within poetry. Those fluent in Japanese already struggle with controlling their fate, so what luck would foreigners have in doing the same? Translation and interpretation can smooth out cultural differences, but they can also be abused. Even then, no words will ever be enough to truly understand one another. To reveal their innermost self is to risk everything: love, pain, betrayal. But to never reveal will lead a lonely life, with the loneliest at the top of the realm. To survive as a lord is to be cunning, observant, patient, and inscrutable. Almost as inscrutable as the divine, for only they know what fate, or Shukumei, everyone holds. And in knowing how to wield it, one might be allowed to become a survivor, while another destined to become. Let's explore the layers of language in Shōgun. As fate would have it, John Blackthorne is marooned into the shores of Japan. He and his crew are immediately impeded not by the stones, but by the language barrier. Unable to explain the nature of their arrival, they're immediately seen as invaders and barbarians to Omi and Ajiro. We see strife appear when both sides are unable to communicate their demands and intent. The only thing they agree on is how savage the other side is. And the only thing understood are insults. Translation should help break down a language barrier, but it is instead reinforced through abuse. Well, not even abuse, no translation is being conducted in this scene. But as he has learned before, John can overcome this barrier through actions and insults, desecrating the priest's cross. He has indicated that a new kind of European has breached Japan, slightly shifting his fate. He is brought before Toranaga to speak directly to, through the assistance of 2 translators, one to guide a conversation and the other to verify. Both successfully break down the language barrier, demonstrated by the frame gradually pushing them out of the scene, and the editing cutting back and forth between Toranaga and Blackthorne, suggesting that they are speaking directly. So, even with a more faithful translator, John is still held prisoner. There's only so much both he and Toranaga can control. Sometimes an unfaithful translator can actually be more helpful, especially when the cultural barrier is actually greater than the language barrier. With Mariko as the Anjin's translator, she omits his vulgar remarks and dresses up his intent to be more respectful.
"Tell this milk-dribbling smear I'm ready to go."
She also uses translation to hint towards cultural customs.
What do you say?
My husband comments on the way you eat your noodles. The sound you make while eating reveals the depth of your pleasure.
Even when Blackthorne learns more Japanese, he still causes strife by weaponizing his words.
Yeah.
And ignoring customs.
Yeah. Ikusa. Hanashi. Anata.
And once more, Mariko comes in and overrides John's remarks to de-escalate the situation. Mariko prioritizes harmonious conversations over literal translation. She knows not only the meaning of the words, but also their weight, acting more as a diplomatic interpreter by relaying intent while bridging both linguistic and cultural differences. Despite her non-exact interpretation, Mariko builds a trust with the Anjin. Not only that, she also builds a trust between him and Toranaga. We're all familiar with the amusing results of direct translations. Literal translation sometimes obfuscates messages more than elucidates, unyielding to differences in grammar and culture, resulting in something nonsensical like Star Wars: The Third Gathers, Backstroke of the West.
Do not war!
Obviously, due to faulty translation, these subtitles do not represent the source well. But can that be the same to Shōgun? For a show about translation, there is a meta layer of trusting the translation of the series itself, that these salient subtitles are faithfully translating what is being said. But like Mariko, the show won't translate everything exactly, balancing what words and customs to teach the audience. Many of the honorifics the characters use to refer to another are omitted to prevent the screen from being cluttered with yellow text. Meanwhile, other words are left untranslated, like Anjin and Shukumei. These could have been translated into the words pilot and fate in the subtitles, but the show instead wishes to teach us these words and their importance. Even English words are taught to have different meanings. For example, the word pillowing is left uninterpreted as a euphemism. It doesn't make much sense in English, but it does indicate a cultural difference. This reminds me of an interview Denis Villeneuve did with Stephen Colbert talking about Dune Part 2. He mentioned how Chani exclaimed something in Chakopsa, the fictional language of Dune, with the subtitles saying, "You're insane." He revealed that what she actually said was, "You're drinking sand," a Fremen idiom for insanity. I kinda wish they kept this, a cultural edge to show more of the Fremen culture. These differences could actually provide more immersion rather than intrusion. And Shogun wants to prioritize a fine viewing experience, which is why the subtitles are presented as such. Co-creators Justin Marks and Rachel Kondo treated localization as something that permeates all aspects of production. Everything from the writing to the cinematography and the editing kept the subtitles in consideration. Enough words were written to not fill the screen, enough space was framed to not block anything, and enough time was given to sync the words with what was shown. The subtitles were carefully designed to be an integral part of the presentation. They were enlarged and raised so that the viewer wouldn't have to look up and down as much, the color is chosen to be visible against any background, and the font given to be legible and add a bit of extra flair. Marks mentioned to Polygon that he was inspired by this scene in Star Wars for the subtitles. The team wanted this accessibility to be part of the artistry and make an impact, which is commendable, but I think John Wick got them beat for most impactful subtitles. But the English subtitles for Shogun are very reliable, so much so that even a Japanese person might rely on them. That's because the show is performed not just in Japanese, but in period Japanese. But being as considerate, there was an intentional balance to not alienate the Japanese audience too much with its classical verbiage. The creators wanted to respect the authenticity of the show and the intelligence of its audience. This respect extends to the English-speaking audience since the show is 70% Japanese. The creators want the audience to trust that the subtitles are worth reading. And in exchange, the creators trust that the audience is curious enough to overcome the show's 1-inch barrier, even entrusting them with some Japanese words. This theme of trust through language very much applies to the characters of Shogun. John immediately bonds with Rodriguez since he's the first person he could comfortably communicate with in Japan. They both share the language of the Portuguese and the language of the sea, becoming somewhat friendly rivals despite their cultures demanding the other one dead. The war between their people seems so irrelevant here in Japan. So much so that Mariko is able to form an intimate bond with John despite knowing his darkest secrets. With secrets of her own, she forgoes them to see Blackthorn as he is in the present, as the Anjin, the one she is to remain closely by as interpreter. And of course, being the only person he could speak to, John becomes close with Mariko. He learns more about the Japanese language and culture through her, but he truly learns how intertwined they are not through words, but through the actions of others, how they acted upon his jest about touching a pheasant. It's not enough to learn the words, but also the weight of them, especially against the fragility of human lives in feudal Japan. And John picks up on this because he knows how loyal his consort Fuji can be. Before, John didn't trust her because he was unfamiliar and unconvinced of how devoted the Japanese are. But she only needed to pull off one action to win his trust, proving that she's willing to fight and die for him, as ordered. John also bonds with Yabashige through witnessing his actions, watching him make a desperate grasp at his fate. Without words, he forms a deep understanding of him, knowing that he too wishes for control of his life, going as far to rob nature of his fate by turning his blade on himself. But this desperation for control ironically makes him more prone to manipulation, bounced around by different lords for the sake of survival. Just like Toranaga's falcons, Yabashige is lured into hunting prey for him. No matter how loyal or treacherous his men can be, it makes no difference to Toranaga, as he can wield both to his advantage. He needs only to know what side they stand on to plan accordingly, hence the necessity for such extreme tests to gauge their faith. Before their words can betray Toranaga, their actions will betray themselves first. Toranaga is well aware of the dangers of language, using words and gestures to hide their true intentions. Raised within high nobility, he has learned to trust nobody, for privacy is as thin as the palace walls. Under Japanese diplomacy, traditions and rituals are set to prevent savagery, cultivating the arts of getting what you want while avoiding asking, to merely suggest to your allies and subtly trick your foes. In this culture, the greatest sin is being too direct, for you override the barrier and the image of the self that everyone works so hard to maintain. An image hidden behind 3 hearts and 8-foot fences. All to hide their true intentions, especially if they're too ambitious. Betrayal only comes from those you share your inner self with. Therefore, Toranaga closes himself off to protect the power he's gifted and cursed with. Michael Corleone may have learned to keep your friends close but your enemies closer. Toranaga has learned to keep his enemies far and his allies further. For his spies will tell all and his eyes will tell none. Trapped within a life of isolation above the clouds, over all who he knows. Unable to speak of the plans he has for them. This is what makes the Shogun as close to the divine as any mortal. But he is still mortal. That much is not forgotten. For all the words and trust we can form, we can never truly know one another. Our hearts have become too guarded and compartmentalized for self-preservation. Rodriguez introduces the concept of the 3 hearts to John and the audience. The first heart is in our mouths for all to hear. The second is in our chest just for our allies. And the final is deep within, reserved only for the self. A necessary partition made within to survive as part of society, while clinging on to some individuality. And each heart can be further divided to fit whatever role or custom. For example, Mariko has different hearts as a mother or wife, Christian or interpreter. There are times when they clash, thus the need to sort out which one is more appropriate. There are also those that have less than 3 hearts, for they have nobody they can fully trust, perhaps only confiding to hearts that no longer pulse. To share your 3rd heart is to expose the self completely, which is where the 8-foot fence comes in. Taught by Mariko, it's a secure omnidirectional barrier that shelters your innermost feelings, a place that guards all of your secrets. In there you are safe, but also alone. Keep the fences shut and you're prone to being misunderstood. Open up the fences and you'll risk exposure and betrayal. You must only leave them slightly agape for others to peer enough through. With the right people, they can speak your thoughts for you, especially when it's too dangerous to do it yourself. Though there are moments where the fences slip open, like Kiku peering through Mariko and sensing her longing for the Anjin. Taking advantage of Mariko's role as interpreter, Kiku evokes this vicarious confession through her. While these aren't Mariko's words, they are her feelings, creating a moment that can only exist in feudal Japan, or a dystopian synthetic future. The vicarious nature of this moment really reminded me of this scene from Blade Runner 2049. The 8-foot fence not only protects your feelings, but also your scars, your haunted past, your desired future, repressed so that you may occupy the present. A place to hide the cracks and the debris of your ruined past, so that you may rebuild and present yourself anew. Like the houses in Japan, rebuilt as soon as they are devastated by the land, sea, and sky. Transience is an aspect of life. Death and decay are inevitable. The best to ask for is not more life, but having lived a purposeful one, ordained by your family, your lord, your god, or yourself. In feudal Japan, they found that purpose in honoring others and their plans, to stray from savagery and put duty above all, even life itself. To die for honor or lack of honor, for the sake of others or in protest of others. With this culture, generations of fodder can be wasted all in the name of conquest and glory. And with deaths being so frequent in this time, it leaves many left behind to suffer, only for them to also wish a purposeful life and death. They are to survive and carry on the fight of the dead, continuing this endless cycle of death and honor. A cycle that also traps Mariko, who wishes for the pull of death after her family has been dishonored. When Eastern ideas fail, she can hold on to Western ones for a different purpose. Christianity saved Mariko through salvation, but it comes with another burden. For when the shame of living is too much to bear, nothing can be done at risk of eternal damnation. But her knowledge of both cultures and their languages will prove to be essential for the upcoming war, and the series of course. The two sides clash within Mariko and her fate, much like John and his beliefs. After being swept into Japan, John goes back and forth in accepting their culture. He questions their beliefs about life and death, freedom and will, that some fights, some people, some rules aren't worth dying for. Yet he learns their language and bonds with the people. Being immersed in Japanese culture for so long, he finds that he isn't so European anymore. He eventually comes to fully accept Japan by embracing his fate there, giving up his dream of dying in his homeland and finding Japan and its people worth dying for. I guess a funny bad face interpretation of Shogun is... John eventually comes to inhabit a fusion of cultures, welcoming his fate in Japan while offering another perspective. The creation of Shogun also has its own fusion of cultures. It mixes Eastern and Western ideas along with modern and traditional ideas. The series, after all, is an American adaptation of an English novel based on historical Japanese events, where historical figures were renamed to give space for creative liberty. The script for the epic show was first written in English, then translated into Japanese, then converted into period Japanese, then performed by the actors who gave their own spin, and then finally subtitled back into English. Co-creator Justin Marks likened this process to a telephone game of translation. And unlike, or actually much like Backstroke of the West, some changes came back better than expected. For example, they initially had Mariko say, "I am more than one thing." Years later, it came back as, co-creator Rachel Kondo found the change so beautiful and poetic, admitting that they could have never come up with that. Another interesting addition to the telephone process is the inclusion of the English dub for Shogun. Yes, Shogun has a dub hidden in an extras tab, and it is just as detailed as the rest of the show. Though unconfirmed, it sounds like some of the cast returned to reprise their roles in English. And if not, then they casted voices similar enough to the original actors, even giving similar delivery, like Ochiba's dulcet tone of voice. You might then ask, for a show about translation, how can they translate if everyone speaks English? Well, the original Japanese and subtitles are retained if multiple languages are spoken. Typically when John appears, the voices revert back to Japanese. It's as if they're like, "Oh shoot, the Anjin is here. He can't know we actually speak English too." The translations of the dub slightly vary from the subtitles to prioritize mouth timing and to match the lip movement. There are some moments where the dub can be considered more authentic than the sub, like Omi's poem spoken here. This is the poem in the sub. The original Japanese follows the Tanka style of poetry, which is what the dub is closer to. Of course, these poems are more than their syllable count, but I'll discuss more about poetry later on. There are also technical details the sub implements well, like matching the voices to their environment and the direction they come from. I think the dub is good for audible accessibility, but personally I still prefer the sub. I use subtitles for English movies anyways, and I even turned on subtitles while watching the dub. But I won't judge you if you prefer the dub, it's still the same story underneath. I'll only judge you if you put the show on in the background and do laundry or something like that. This is not the show for that. With the level of detail and authenticity, this is a show that demands your attention. Though it can't be completely authentic, with changes balancing artistry and practicality. We should be thankful that Shogun at least has English. Remember, they're supposed to be speaking Portuguese, not English.
Good morning, senor. I am to be your interpreter for today.
You speak Portuguese?
It was already a gamble to make the show mostly in Japanese, especially for an American production, so I can't imagine the show being so authentic to the point of having zero English. Marx admitted that it would be extremely difficult to find a cast that can speak Japanese and Portuguese, although you might be surprised by how many Japanese still speak Portuguese today. It's better than omitting translating altogether, like in the original 1980 adaptation of Shogun. I guess if you want the true, authentic Shogun experience, you should find a Portuguese dub. Not just Portuguese, but ancient Portuguese, and be completely immersed in the dire need of translation. One of the hardest things to translate is poetry, since it is so fundamentally tied to the artistry of its original language. Poetry is integral to Shogun and samurai culture. The official viewer's guide for Shogun goes as far to declare that you are not considered a real samurai if you are not a good poet. Which is why in the middle of a samurai game where you slash people up, you could also rest and make haikus. For the samurai, poetry offers a much needed moment of peace and reflection. Especially before falling to a blade, a death poem would accompany many of them to their demise. You must have a mind as sharp as your blade. To compose a great poem, you would have to be keen, quick, clever, and erudite. And those unable to create nor appreciate poetry are seen as barbarians. Poetry is its own language, just as potent in connecting people, gauging acumen, and relaying secrets that can turn the tides of war. The poems in Shogun provide more insight into the characters as well as hints toward their fate, although you might notice that the words don't exactly match the syllable count of the tanka form. I believe the writers prioritize finding the most appropriate words to match the original, then finding an alternative that deviates to better fit the form. Which makes sense, poems are contingent to their words more than their structure. And with the priority on translating the approximate words, they can better display the brilliance of Maruko's poetry. Admittedly, I'm not the best at showcasing that brilliance, but I saw a video and essay from Niall O'Sullivan that could better break down the poems of Shogun. And the viewer's guide also has a breakdown of some of the poetry. From what it seems, there is much depth and detail in the poetry, much like the rest of Shogun. To truly appreciate beauty is to accept its imperfections, and this tension also exists within the soundtrack and cinematography. Listening to the music, I wonder why some electronic sounds were mixed with traditional instruments. For the authenticity of the show, I thought the soundscape would only comprise of the instruments of the time. Composers Atticus Ross, Leopold Ross, and Nick Chuba added the electronic effects for the sake of psychology. Real traditional instruments were used to obtain an authentic texture for the soundtrack, but by themselves they sounded too pleasant for the eeriness the composers wanted to capture, thus the added distortion. And depending on the track, it could be used to create atmosphere, horror, longing, and a variety of tones. The composers didn't want to just create Japanese music, they wanted to create music for the characters and the story, letting the soundtrack communicate how the characters are feeling for when there are no words. Director Jonathan Von Tolkien and cinematographer Chris Ross also had a similar goal in mind, using anamorphic lenses to distort the image for the subjectivity of the characters, creating these intense spiral blurs to represent disorientation, and dark vignettes in the corner for isolation. In return, they'd have to distort the beautiful sets and costumes the other departments worked so hard for. But there's a beauty to the blur, a fading and transience. Tolkien didn't want to fetishize the setting with ultra-crisp cameras, for as beautiful as everything seems, there still lies a horror and danger. And of course, the team wanted to put the focus on the characters. While the traditional elements like the clothing and instruments are made for the setting, the modern effects and distortion are made for the characters and the story. Nothing is perfect, nothing is permanent. An acceptance is due to truly appreciate all, and to be free of suffering. This applies not only to beauty, but also fate and mortality, which comes core to what Shogun is trying to communicate. The characters are all prisoners in their own ways, not just literal. Prisoners to politics, to societal norms, and to fate or Shukumei itself, trapped in playing out their roles and serving their purpose, speaking the scripts they have to recite. They're a piece in the game of shogi, oblivious of the players and their gambits, serving their purpose by either living or dying. We are all powerless to human order and natural chaos. To reject and resist will only bring suffering and madness. Even in the belief of free will, we can be fettered by freedom itself, overwhelmed by infinite decisions. Perhaps it's better to accept fate, to have everything decided for you, whether by your family, your lord, or your god. to be free of all responsibility and let the greater whole guide you. But to follow through reluctantly or mindlessly is to eventually lose yourself, to forfeit all motivation and live in despair, becoming a desolate prisoner to fate. However, Shukumei does not directly translate to fate because it is not the same. Shukumei cannot be changed, for it was predetermined by past lives or the circumstances of one's birth, but it is not something to surrender to. Shukumei is to be embraced and wielded with full intention. It is what you deserve, a purpose aligned with your will, something to both live and die for within a greater system. Perhaps Shukumei can be explained by another belief apart from Buddhism and Shintoism. It can be found in serenity, by accepting what we cannot change, changing what we can, and knowing when to do either. Shukumei cannot be controlled, for it is like the wind, flowing through everything long before and after our existence. To fight against it will only bring ruin. To idly follow is to be swept away. Believe in them or not, the gales cannot be stopped, but they can be studied, taught by the language of the seas, the sky, and those around you. And once the patterns of the chaos are seen, they can be grasped to your advantage, caught by the sails of your ship to go wherever you desire, as long as you have the vigilance, patience, and fortitude. Whatever fortune or tragedy the wind may bring, both will offer opportunities to act upon. To follow your Shukumei, you need not the divine power of a shogun. You need only to accept your role as the Anjin.